We tend to think of what's going on in Syria in religious terms, and a lot of the talk about what's going on in the Middle East is in religious terms, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's not about Islam. But I think, once again, if we look at it purely in those terms, we miss major portions of what's happening. Part of it political, but in this case I want to talk about ethnic. Everybody knows that the Alawites, the Assad regime is an Alawite regime, are tied in with the Iranians who are Shiites. The Shiites are supporting them because the Shiites and the Alawites sort of have something to do with each other, which, by the way, they don't really. And by calling it religious, we also give it the sense that it's about differences of faith. They say the Shahada this way, they say the Shahada that way, and that's why they're murdering each other. So I'll submit, first of all, that a good deal of it has to do with internal power, but more importantly, the Alawites see themselves not only as a religious group, they are an ethnic group. This is key, because what makes ethnic war different from any other type of war is you can't change sides. In other words, unlike a political or an ideological war, you can't see the light. You can't quit. And by the way, here I should mention, wars end when the loser quits. The winner determines the outcome, the loser determines when. The Alawites, looking at what's happening around them, and the Alawites tend to be secular in the sort of scheme of the Muslim world. The Muslim world doesn't even consider them to be Muslims, they consider them to be heretics. The Alawites, looking at what's going on around them and the opposition to them, have come to a very interesting and a highly justified conclusion. And that is that if they lose, they're going to be massacred. And nobody's going to come to their rescue. In other words, what happened in Iraq with the oppression of the Sunni minority after the fall of Saddam, the response in the Sunni world was to come to their rescue. And that's part of what we're seeing in Iraq, Syria today. The Alawites know that that's not going to happen. So we have an interesting phenomenon. We have a population that makes up about 10% of the population of Syria. And by the way, I tell my students, if you ever want to lie and tell the truth at the same time, use percentages. Right? 10% doesn't sound like much. But if I say 2.5 million people, it's already a lot of people. So we have 2.5 million people who believe they'll be massacred if they lose or quit. They control the Air Force, they control major tank forces, special forces, some infantry units. They're backed by Hezbollah, Iran, and the Russians. Why should they quit? And they won't, and they don't. Another dirty little secret of that regime in terms of the sides taken up is that the second largest group within the Syrian regime are the secular Sunnis. In other words, here again, that division, the Sunnis are versus the Alawites, and the Shiites are supporting the Alawites because they're against the Sunnis. The second largest group within the regime are the secular Sunni business people in the middle class. Sort of flies in the face of what we have understood otherwise. Now, why do they support the regime? For a very simple reason. When the Sunni secular businessman comes home from work at the end of the day, he wants to do what every other businessman in the world wants to do at the end of the day. He wants to have his martini or the equivalent. If Al-Qaeda or ISIS takes over his country, he's not going to have it. I'm oversimplifying the point, but it's his lifestyle. He wants his wife to dress like Mrs. Assad, and if you haven't seen a picture of Mrs. Assad, look her up. She's a Vogue fashion model. Under ISIS, his wife is going to have a fashion choice. Black burqa, gray burqa, brown burqa. It's not what he wants. And they're supporting the regime. The bottom line on this is that they are not going to quit. And those who eulogized Assad, you remember at the beginning of the fighting, he's going to be gone in a week, in a month, in 2 months, and dragged on. Here I can say I'm generally a low-tech guy. Here I like the internet because there are lectures that I gave back then that said then he's not going to quit. And I'll take it a step further. And here, unlike Libya, even if he drops dead this minute, which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, his regime isn't going anywhere. In other words, it's not going to fall apart like Saddam's regime, and it's not going to disintegrate like Gaddafi's regime. So this fight is going to go on.